On behalf of the Foyle Ethical Investment Campaign and the Bloody Sunday March Committee, I'm Peter Doran, and I want to welcome you to our very special event this evening. We've called the event A University of Free Derry, Decolonising Regional Economic Development in a Time of Ecological and Constitutional Transitions. Before I say a few words about the origins of tonight's event, I want to invite you to join me for a few moments in honouring the names of those who died at the hands of the state on Bloody Sunday 50 years ago this month. Jim?
Jackie Duddy, 17. James Ray, 22. Jared Donaghy, 17. Michael McDade, 20. Bernard McGuigan, 41. Hugh Gilmore, 17. Jared McKinney, 35. John Young, 17. Patrick Doherty, 31. William Nash, 19. Kevin McElhinney, 17. Michael Kelly, 17. William McKinney, 27. And John Johnson, 59.
Thank you, Jim. Tonight's event is a contribution to a discussion that has been led by Garvin Downey and Colin McFeely of the Derry University Group. And we thank them for that work and for creating this possibility. The discussion also has its origins in one of the most far-reaching cross-community demands of the civil rights movement in Derry, that demand for a local university founded in a deep intuition that knowledge and freedom walk together. The demand for an autonomous cross-border university has never been more compelling. It is a demand that still resonates on our streets, and in this time of ecological emergencies, it can also extend a voice to the rights of the more than human, to those other communities of species also invested in our ecological wisdom and memory. In this historic moment of intense dialogue and multiple transitions for our island, for our constitutional future, for our planetary home, and for this beloved place, our Foyle bioregion that we love, and from which we draw life, livelihoods, identities, and intense pleasures. The demand for a new university or a new centre of knowledge production is also about restoring agency to our cross-border city region. It is also about embedding a deep culture of free thinking and praxis. It is also about celebrating local knowledge, languages, and our cultural genius. It is about the possibility of co-producing regenerative visions for a post-extractivist, decolonised economic narrative in which we, at last, can become subjects of our own histories. And above all tonight, it is about a conversation. So I'd like to hand over with great pleasure to our facilitator and my colleague at Queen's University, Dina Zoe Beluigi. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, for your introduction and framing the talk today. I'm honoured to chair this, the first in a series of events situated within a period of commemoration of Bloody Sunday, to deliberate a university of and for Derry. As a South African, as a scholar of universities seeking understandings that'll take us to more just democratic futures, I thank the organisers for asking me to chair this discussion, to listen with you who are here participating, and to see how we might find commonalities and solidarity as we engage with the four speakers. You would have seen in the information of the event that there are 3 questions that frame today, and that the speakers have been carefully chosen to share insights, to catalyze discussion, and most importantly, to provide openings for us as the audience, and particularly those who are in Derry, so that the past is not repeated nor reproduced in the present, least of all by a university. The first question thus pointedly asks us, what are the vital elements of a radical vision of a university in the spirit of free Derry? So this question directs us tonight to think about what are the dear principles, purposes, practices, and forms if this is going to be radical, not more of the same or business as usual, but rather transformative and wrestling with power, justice, and emancipation, if indeed this is going to be a university that is fit for purpose for Derry, its histories of struggle and resistance, and its desire for future flourishing. We are then given 2 questions that are framed in ways which show this is no naive endeavor. There is a sense of contrast or balance. On the one hand, the harsh reality of what has been and is, the colonial, the neoliberal, the poverty, the sense of being overlooked and perhaps abandoned, in the dominant narratives of universities and of Derry. And then with the necessity to push through these narratives, to exert, claim, shape, and generate what should be. So the second question asks us to consider, taking into account the colonized history of higher education on the island, what is the public mission of a 21st century university institution that can restore agency, autonomy, and thought leadership to local communities by advancing a regenerative vision of social and ecological development? The first part of that question very much relates to the contribution tonight of Owen O'Quinnigan, who will share his research about the ways in which the settler colonial university delegitimated the knowledge systems and language of Ireland, giving us a sense of the potential of a different university, perhaps the one you imagine, to bear witness to that loss, while also growing more rooted possibilities. The third question then brings in some of the problematics of the present, which beset contemporary universities and the socio-economic milieu. It asks, given the dominant neoliberal model of higher education and its approaches to economic development, how can a radical new research-led institution model new approaches to liberation, sustainable prosperity, and equality? While a number of the presenters may touch on aspects of this, Professor John Barry in particular will be looking at the concerns of the neoliberal Western University and its relationship to environmental justice and economic development. To engender critical hope, Mary McManus will draw on central principles of community wealth building for the social economy and examples of universities which take the social good as central to their public mission, talking to us about an anchor university in Derry. Each speaker will present for 10 minutes, brief, so we can percolate. The recording will be made open access, and many of the speakers will point to resources to further our engagement with what they introduce here. You're encouraged to contribute during the presentations by posting your thoughts and questions in the chat space, which I'll look at and incorporate as time allows. If it's for a specific speaker, please address it to them. In addition to your participation, here to listen and respond formally is educator and the author of the book Designing Regenerative Futures, Daniel Wall, who will respond to the content of the presentations with possibilities for socio-ecological learning and praxis. While I'm here as chair, if time allows, I also hope to respond to by making some connections to scholarship in critical higher education studies and my own observations as an African higher education scholar. But if not, I'll do so in writing. So for now, please sit forward, listen actively as I introduce Owen, our first panelist. Owen is reading towards his doctorate on the history of the Irish University, with a focus on the colonial experience and interest in Gaelic epistemologies. He teaches at Linnaeus University in English literature and migration, and supervises in the areas of decoloniality, anti-racism, white innocence, Irish literature, and oral knowledge. Owen?
Diva Kharja, can you hear me? Can I just ask that?
Yes, beautifully.
Okay. Well, it's an honor for me to speak at this remembrance event and share some of the insights from my PhD research, which focuses on how traditional singing practice in the Irish language resisted forms of colonial domination through its educational narrative function. Key in my research is how the university project in Ireland was instrumental in managing and disempowering these indigenous modes of expression by discounting them as real knowledge, and further disempowerment through the use of folklorizing and romanticizing frameworks. I'll use the term epistemology and epistemic in this presentation, but these terms are synonymous with ways of knowing. They are related to how we know, what knowledge we have access to, and who defines what valid knowledge is. I draw upon Ndlovu Gacheni's argument that all people should be born into an epistemological system that affirms their being, their ancestors' historical experiences, and ways of understanding the world. Ndlovu Gacheni draws upon scholars such as Mudimbe, who in the context of African decolonization says that without critiquing the way colonialism has controlled what we know, our efforts at decolonization will be in vain. And Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who draws attention to the necessity for critiquing the dominant colonial epistemologies through a reclaiming of our indigenous languages. In Ireland, the continuations of colonialism in terms of its direct rule and exclusion from the domains of knowledge and power, perhaps are greatest in intensification in the city of Derry. The refusal to construct a university here can be considered a form of epistemic violence. The way that universities represent themselves follows a particular rhetoric that is based on the narrative that they are sites of progress, emancipation, discovery, and modern thinking. However, there is a darker side to universities that is not revealed in their self-conceptions. Universities solidify capitalist notions of competition, individualism, and exclusion, as well as organized labor and curricula through race, sex, gender, and class. Not only are universities complicit in imperialism, but they were directly involved in enforcing and extracting from the enslaved and colonized. Research by Ramon Grossfogel highlights that the construction of the westernized university involved conquest and epistemic extraction of the natives of Turtle Island, enslaved, kidnapped Africans, Muslims and Jews in Al-Andalus, and women's oral knowledge. Ivan Periáñez Bolaño would add to this the genocides against the Gitanos and Roma people. Grossfogel argues that from 1492, coloniality has shaped the structure of knowledge in westernized universities, which he describes as being based on the knowledge from white men from 5 countries. Grossfogel speaks further to the ways that the university has excluded and devalued the knowledge systems of the colonized through Western logics such as universalism and dualisms. Lewis Gordon speaks to universities as spaces of decontextualized and disembodied knowledge. He points out what he refers to as the decadence of disciplinization, where the university does not respond to local or communal needs. Instead, the disciplines become monuments to themselves, adhering to capitalist and sanitizing sensibility. Bill Ralston has spoken out on this specific phenomenon in the 6 counties, when thinking about how universities completely ignored what was going around them during the insurgencies and counterinsurgencies of the 1970s and 1980s. The embeddedness in community speaks directly to Mary McManus's talk in relation to community wealth building in terms of the university becoming an anchor institution. Research carried out by Philomena Essed and Kwame Nimako showed how universities police and control minoritized people while excluding them in the research process. They showed in the Dutch context how an all-white minorities research industry sought to influence policymaking in the 1980s that would segregate Dutch society on racial lines. Along with Willemsen, Nimako argues that since enslavement, colonial powers continue to deny full emancipation to Black people. Although a different scenario, this idea of managing the trajectories of emancipation is relevant within the Northern Ireland system and in the denial of a university in Derry. In her research on AIDS researchers in Azania, Dr. Nokotulu Labagane tells us upon hearing that white AIDS researchers had arrived in the township, the potential research subjects would usually disperse in fear. This type of relation and experience that is concealed within the Westernized university's self-conception and is constitutive of a view on coloniality, which can only be generated by the victims of colonialism. There is much to be said about the colonial structure of universities in Ireland. As well as pointing out their roots in the 1492 conquest, we could include the penalising laws that denied education to the majority colonised population from the 1690s, the 1845 construction of the Queen's colleges along secular imperial lines, referred to as godless colleges with their exclusion of theology, a central domain for the reflection on the meaning of humanity of the day, or the response from the Newman Catholic University. Newman wished to implant an English language university oriented around training Catholics for industry instead of philosophical reflection. Furthermore, we could reflect on partition's effect in terms of the Free State Catholic theocracy's censorship and suppression of critical and subversive thinking, and the Northern Ireland system's epistemic exclusion and fear of decolonial consciousness and justice. For the sake of time, I will focus on the establishment of the College of the Holy and Undivided Trinity of Queen Elizabeth, a landmark moment in the construction of the epistemic colonial turn in Ireland. The university only admitted Protestant men from its inception and formed as a sister college at both Cambridge and Oxford. From its outset, it denied contemporaneous Gaelic epistemologies, which always ran concurrent to the colonial knowledge systems, and responded to them in and on their own terms and in fragmented ways. Despite being experts on plants, agriculture, land, animals, and ecology, Irish language speakers were looked down on and not seen to possess scientific knowledge. Trinity College's participation in colonialism was not only to support the proselytization eugenics or by sending undemocratic officials to Westminster, but in the university's role itself in the plantation of Ulster, as it was a central planning institution, along with army veterans, the City Guilds of London, and Scottish and English undertakers. Trinity College was categorized as an undertaker, meaning that it would seize and profit from lands that were stolen from natives in Ulster. 50% of the lands of Southwest Armagh, 25% of the lands of Clankelly, Southeast Fermanagh, 25% of the lands of Tirhue in South Donegal, and 10% of the lands in Doe on the border with Fanad, North Donegal, would be in the direct proprietorship of Trinity College. In this sense, Trinity College should be understood as a land grab university. Trinity's stolen possessions were framed within a desire to inculcate English civility in Ulster. The theft of these lands was based on totally ignoring the Brehon laws that existed to demarcate territory between the Gaelic clans and the oral legal epistemologies that surrounded these laws. In this ignoring of the oral testimony, one can locate a construction of a strategy of ignorance, which Anglo-centric knowledge in Ireland is based on. Much discussion on decolonisation has been emerging from these centres of power. The question remains, why are places like Oxford and Trinity College attempting to take the lead on discussions of colonialism and appointing themselves as institutions of liberation? Why are the places that designed and practiced violent colonialism in Ireland in charge of advocating epistemic justice? Marie Batiste, the Indigenous scholar from Potlatech First Nations, describes colonial violence as a disease that has a cure. If an institution has been so much involved in the production of the disease, can it present itself as the cure? Or could a free Derry University connect to Derry's insurgent role in opening up civil rights conversation and commitment to justice? Could a free Derry University be an appropriate place to lead the antidote for decolonial justice? And I would like to finish on two final reflections. The first is a helpful task towards epistemic justice should involve universities relating themselves to the colonial violence that happened on the very soil the university stands on and the violence going on outside its doors. This requires a relational undertaking. And secondly, in the words of the great decolonial scholar Maria Lugones, it necessitates working from difference towards coalition. There are multiple experiences of coloniality in Ireland. For example, the traveller Minker epistemologies, Gaelic epistemologies, Black epistemologies, and the experiences of Black people and people of colour. Resurgent, insurgent, and combative concepts should come from a coalitional dialogue between all these members of the residents of the island of Ireland, where they could work from difference to bring colonial, racist, patriarchal systems to an exact end. Thanks very much for listening to my talk.
Thank you so much, Owen. That was really, really interesting and very rich. And I'm really hoping that people post responses in the chat bar so that later on somebody like me won't speak too much in the discussion. Thank you, Owen. We'll now move over to hear from John, who's a professor of political economy at Queen's University in Belfast, a former Green Party councillor, and currently part of the place-based climate action network, PCAN, which was formed in partnership between the Belfast City Council and the university. What is of interest is that that network aims to translate climate policy into action on the ground in the hopes of bringing about transformative change.
That's great. Thank you, Dina, and thank you to the organisers for inviting me. I have nothing as polished as Owen. I think you've got a bright career ahead of you, Owen, as an academic, where you're outshining the professor in your professional capacity to communicate in a very rich manner such a complex set of issues. And funnily enough, some of the issues I want to provide as seeds, as provocations, as suggestions for ultimately the people who should make these decisions are the people of Derry and Donegal. But it does resonate with some of the issues that Owen raised. And if there's nothing else that you remember from what I'm going to say, I'm just going to give you some buzzwords or slogans in a way that I think encapsulates certainly what I want to communicate to you tonight. One of them is decolonize, decarbonize, and democratize. And I'll talk about that in a moment. I think what we need to start considering, not just in any proposal for a free university of Derry, which I think is long overdue, but also in the already existing institutions where people like myself and Peter and Dina and indeed Owen work, is we need to unlearn quite a lot. And so any of the proposals I'm making tonight aren't just about for a new free university of Derry, but actually it stands as a critical mirror to the existing institutions of higher learning. And I think we have a lot of unlearning to do. So I do think that place-based approach is absolutely correct, not just because of what Dina mentioned in terms of the research I do on resolutely localized and place-based climate action, but actually our current university system is global in its approach. It's often very loosely tethered to its local community. And that means that it's part of this neoliberal sense of the commodification of education with very little connection to the real felt needs and interest of its local communities. And I think Mary McManus's talk will be a salutary alternative to that in terms of the role of higher education institutions such as universities as essential anchor institutions for community wealth building. As a dub, and I say this respectfully, I'm going to give the good people of Derry in their discussions on these issues some suggestions, but speaking as an outsider. I think in the spirit of Free Derry and the civil rights movement and its enduring idea of resistance as being fertile, not futile, and also then I think in those iterations of, harbingers or precursors for, a free university in Derry, such as I'm thinking here in particular of the Field Day Collective, that wonderful upsurging of cultural and artistic and intellectually robust responses to the conflict in the North in around 1980, with people like Brian Friel, who just sadly, recently passed away, wonderful actors such as Stephen Ray, the poet and author Seamus Dean. And I think there within Derry itself, you already have some of the seeds or embers with which then to guide any critical local place-based ideas around what education should be. And just as the initiative around the Field Day began as a response to that stage of the conflict in Ireland, I think we're now at a particular turning point that, as Peter and both Dina alluded to, we are now entering the 6th great mass extinction event across the planet. We are now living in a planetary emergency in terms of the worsening conditions of life on Earth. And therefore, I think there's another opportunity of a response to a crisis in the same way that the Field Day responded. Well, what is the response that we need now that is resolutely place-based, but globally focused in the context of what we call in the academy, in this awful term, the Anthropocene, the age of the human, or as some of us would rather call it, the capital of scene, the way in which, as Owen pointed out, the commodification of a lot of our education and indeed a lot of the ways in which we live our lives has become corrupted, including in the work of Peter Dorr and the colonisation of our very attention and imaginary. I would, in a way, to not quite disagree with Owen, but I don't think John Henry Cardinal Newman was all bad, at least the non-Catholic bits that he was talking about. And John Henry Cardinal Newman had a wonderful essay called The Idea of a University. And if you divest it from its Catholicism, it really is about the idea of a liberal arts, an interdisciplinary approach to education. And I do think there are elements in Newman's idea that could be dusted off, updated and adapted to help inform either it's a free university in Derry or the reform of higher education in our existing universities. I do think that idea of a public mission for the university, and certainly speaking as a member of Queen's like Dina and Peter, our university may give lip service to being a civic university, but I think we need a lot more demonstrable intent about what does that mean? How is the university attending to the needs of its local community when it seems to be spending a lot more money and effort on internationalization in terms of bringing in students from outside? And I'm not against that idea of cross-cultural global exchange, but it has been in the last 30 years, for me as an academic, the pendulum has gone too far in delocating and delocalizing universities from their specific places. And if something else, and I think that this would happen in Derry, about having it resolutely rooted in the context of where you are, the ecology, Dyra, the oak, the ecological dimension that Peter mentioned, but also then reflecting upon the part Derry has played in decolonizing and looking at the history of dispossession that we have on this island. So one suggestion, and here I'm just reflecting on work that we're trying to get done here at Queen's, is to see that research, teaching, engagement, and on-site procurement. So where would a Free University of Derry get its energy, get its food? You know, it could be an exemplar in a place-based sustainable university. What about having a unique feature of any pedagogic program within the university where we can democratize the curriculum, where we have the audacity to ask students, age appropriate and not for every subject, of course, but what would they like to learn? Because I often think that students, certainly in primary and secondary school, they're being taught information, and I speak as a father who's had 2 children go through the system here in the North, and indeed reflecting upon my own primary and secondary school education, that we need to learn the lessons of something like Paulo Freire and the pedagogy of the oppressed. And one way of doing that is, as I say, having the audacity to ask our communities, our students, well, what are the types of knowledges that we want any university to be providing? At the moment, universities, as befits neoliberal institutions which are run as businesses, universities are more adept and more comfortable in dealing with businesses, and maybe to some extent with policymakers and politicians, but resolutely not in engaging with communities and civil society groups. And I think on that issue, I think any discussions you're having there in Derry could be informed by, addressing that particular imbalance. And then I would say, as an example, and it partly draws upon my own research, is in the spirit of decolonisation and decarbonising, is to see that the origins of central ideas that we take for granted in modern society, like economic growth and GDP, they have their origins in 17th century colonised Ireland. And in particular in the role that a man called Sir William Petty, who was a Cromwellian soldier, major landowner, who's accredited as being the first person to systematically develop a concept of economic growth. But it was born in a colonial context, born in an imperialist context, and that idea has traveled through history and has done untold damage ecologically in terms of an obsession with abstract notions of GDP, which don't actually bring good jobs, the fruits of which are distributed very, very unevenly. And so the last thing I would say, I'm delighted to make these comments, more than happy to continue the conversation, and that really we need to see that there's a connection here between peace and sustainability in terms of education with a purpose to both empower people, but also to see that in people, planet, and place, that to me lies the terrain of any new education institution. So thanks for listening.
Thank you, John. And I think in a way you've set the ground quite well for the need of what Mary is going to be speaking about now for us. So I'm going to briefly introduce Mary, who's an independent researcher and an advocate for more systemic solutions to create a society that is fairer to both people and planet. In 2020, she researched the anti-poverty potential of community well-being as part of her postgraduate studies. She's over 2 decades of experience working in welfare rights sector and has been the director of the East Belfast Independent Advice Centre for 15 years. She's also a member of the grassroots group Right to Work, Right to Welfare, who campaign for social security reform and fair employment, and is a board member of Collaboration for Change. Thank you, Mary. Over to you.
Thanks, Dina. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak at the 50th anniversary commemoration event. I was actually up here in 2015, speaking on a panel about austerity and welfare reform, about the impact of that. As Dina said, I spent over 24 years working in the welfare rights sector, and my interest in this is very much coming from the perspective of wanting to bring about change to do with poverty. So it feels really fitting that I'm back here in 2022, 7 years later, to speak about community wealth building, which I think is a very doable regenerative approach that we can take to begin creating fairer outcomes for people. Poverty and inequality have been increasing for years and are currently at historic highs. The rise of food banks has long been the canary in the mine, demonstrating to us that we need to change our systems to ensure that everybody has enough and no one suffers the injustice of poverty. And we ensure that we operate within planetary boundaries. And so I should have said, I'm going to briefly go through the model of community wealth building before focusing on the role that universities are currently playing in places around the world, or places across the UK. I will mostly focus on Preston, because Preston is the place where community wealth building has been practiced the longest. We need to do something to ensure that everybody has enough and that nobody suffers the injustice of poverty, and that we operate within planetary boundaries. I spent many years talking about the poverty problem, but community wealth building has taught me to see that poverty isn't the issue, it's the wealth. We're actually blessed with considerable wealth, but it is not shared and equally distributed. To ensure more equal distribution, we did different economic systems, such as community wealth building, which is also known as the Preston model due to the city's pioneering work. Community wealth building is a common sense approach to local economic development that is centered on ensuring that the wealth already in a place is kept circulating rather than leaking away. It is also a more democratic approach that aims to put more ownership, more control, and more of the benefits in the hands of local people. Places that have comprehensively adopted community wealth building as their approach to social and economic justice are also using it to achieve environmental justice and as a means to recover from the pandemic. Very importantly, community wealth building through Preston has demonstrated proof of concept. Between 2013 and 17, community wealth building in Preston led to the creation of 4,000 new real living wage jobs, a reduction in unemployment from 6.5% to 3.1%, and a 10% rise in 16 to 24-year-olds in Preston receiving an NVQ level 3 education. This led to Preston being named the most improved city in the UK in 2018 and moving out of the top 20% most deprived cities. And as you can see, it did very well from this side, it did very well in comparison to cities in the same region. Preston has inspired numerous other cities and places to adopt the approach. The Scottish Government hoped to pass a Community Wealth Building Act in this parliamentary term. The Welsh Government is exploring the approach, and here the Minister for Communities committed to embedding community wealth building into her department's development and spend priorities. So how does it work in practice? Local anchor institutions are key to the approach. These are public institutions such as councils, universities, or health trusts, for example. They are called anchors because they are not likely to up sticks and move elsewhere. They have significant amount of assets and spending power. Community wealth building has 5 principles. The first principle is fair employment and just labour markets. Anchors pay the real living wage and have progression routes and target recruitment at lower income areas, improving the prospects of local people and local economies. So, for example, in Preston, the council became a real living wage employer. According to the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, 1 in 8 workers in the UK are now classed as working poor. In Northern Ireland, about 21% of employers don't pay the real living wage, as opposed to 14% in Scotland. There are 124 higher education institutions accredited in the UK, 82 in England, 34 in Scotland, 8 in Wales, and none here. The second pillar of community wealth building is progressive procurement of goods and services. This is about local anchor institutions collaborating to ensure that how they procure services and goods supports the local economy. In 2013, 6 Preston anchors analysed their combined procurement spend of 750 million and discovered that 458 million was leaking out of Preston and Lancashire. They broke down their contracts to ensure that local SMEs and cooperatives could bid. They introduced social clauses into their tenders and had meet the buyer events to support local businesses to tender for contracts. They brought 274 million back into the local economy, which helped to achieve the outcomes referred to previously. This has also helped to create a more resilient economy, as Preston had a furlough rate at the end of 2020 of 6.9% compared with the UK average of 12.5%. And this slide is actually taken from the launch of Preston's new community wealth building strategy. And these are people from the anchors And it's really worth watching to see how excited they are about how they're using procurement for public good. So this leads to the third pillar, plural ownership or more democratic ownership of the economy. Preston have not only been supporting local small, medium enterprises, they're also creating more democratically owned businesses by developing cooperatives. And I'm going to come back to that later in the presentation. They're investing in a cinema and leisure complex. This is Preston Council, which will be owned by the council, ensuring good working conditions and that local people benefit from the profits. North Ayrshire are developing municipally owned solar farms. Small, medium enterprises, cooperatives, and municipally owned businesses all help lock wealth into a place and stop leaking away to private shareholders, which is financially generative for the local economy. The fourth pillar is socially just use of land and property. Anchor institutions own a significant amount of land and assets. In Belfast, 40% of the land is owned by anchor institutions, with Belfast City Council and the Harbour Commission owning 34% between them. In the community wealth building model, these assets are treated as part of our common wealth, and their functioning and ownership provides a social and financial benefit for citizens. This can involve placing assets such as a building in community control through a community asset transfer or social asset transfer, for example. The final pillar of community wealth building is making financial power work for local places. Now, this is about increasing flows of investment within local economies by harnessing and recirculating the wealth that already exists, as opposed to attracting capital. So, for example, instead of savings being placed in a private bank where shareholders benefit, they could be placed in a mutually owned bank that would support local businesses. There are plans underway in many regions of the UK to develop a mutual bank, including in Preston, and there's also a campaign for this region called the Northern Mutual, and I would really urge you to get behind that campaign. I can put the details in the chat afterwards. How are public sector pension funds invested? Could they be invested in a way that supports the local community? In Preston, they invested 100 million of local authority pension funds in student housing to benefit their community rather than a project further afield. So that's the community wealth building model. So to move on now to look in greater detail at the role universities can play. This is taken from the US. Community wealth building has been referred in the US to the EDS and MEDS approach, as educational and medical institutions have played a key role in early work on the model there, such as in Cleveland, which influenced the Preston model. This slide shows a current project between the Coalition of Urban and Metropolitan Universities and the Democracy Collaborative. They have formed an anchor learning network to systemically transform higher education to fully serve its public mission and advance the long-term social, economic, and physical health of their communities. You can see they do this by way of research, employment, procurement, and investment, and research. So to go back to Preston, Preston's early achievements that I've spoken about earlier in this presentation were mainly achieved through paying the real living wage and progressive collaborative procurement. Their community wealth building agenda, however, is ambitious and very much a long-term strategy, as this diagram of the Preston model ecosystem demonstrates. According to Dr. Julian Manley of the University of Central Lancashire, community wealth building is not just an economic ambition. They want to change the social fabric in Preston to make it more cooperative. The council leader, Matthew Brown, has said that it is about gradual and comprehensive change. The council is working closely with the university on this agenda. More than this is the Preston Cooperative Development Network. More than £750,000 was committed to setting up and seed funding 10 startup worker cooperatives in Preston. This project is a partnership between Preston Council, the University of Central Lancashire, and Cooperatives UK. This funding, either in cash or in-kind support, was secured from the Open Society Foundation, as well as coming from the University, City Council, and Cooperatives UK. So far, they have set up the Preston Cooperative Development Centre, which will promote the development of cooperatives by providing advice, consultancy, and training. It also provides grants to start up cooperative businesses. Some of their current projects are around food buying, housing, and a digital and taxi drivers co-op. The plan to create a network of worker The plan is to create a network of worker cooperatives based on the Mondragon model. These cooperative businesses will address any gaps in the market in Preston to increase anchor procurement spend within the local economy. Adult education is also key to their plan, as they recognise that there is a lack of knowledge among the population with regard to the cooperative business models. They have set up the Preston Cooperative Education Centre, itself a co-op and the first union co-op to be established in the UK. Again, inspired by Mondragon, it is part of the wider efforts to create a cooperative ecosystem within Preston. Oh, sorry. The goal is to grow this cooperative into a substantial provider of cooperative education and worker education, eventually to become part of the future Federated Cooperative University project as part of a partnership with the Cooperative College. An ambition is for the Preston Cooperative Education Centre to eventually be a significant and inclusive community resource, helping to reach, support and connect diverse groups, workers and unemployed people of all ages and community activists. They are bringing in training from Mondragon and an organisation in the US called One Worker, One Vote. The University of Central Lancashire is also playing a role in researching the Preston model. Across the water, universities are joining forces with other anchor organisations to form anchor networks in many places. Here is an example of the anchors involved in the Birmingham Anchor Network. Following the economic devastation of COVID-19, public sector anchors such as these will be the economic lifeblood of places. How they choose to spend their money and use their assets will be crucial to the recovery. Community wealth building allows us to imagine a new normal where we use the wealth we already have in place to create a fairer, more regenerative economy and society. A free Derry university could play a lead role in advancing the community wealth building model in Derry. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary. So these three presentations, while brief, have brought to the forefront the problematics, but also the possibilities that lie before a university in Derry. In the chat stream, a number of important points and questions have been raised. Thank you. And thank you also to those who've posted resources and links for the conversation to grow its own rhizomes. I'll read some of the points now and ask the panelists to respond. So in part, what we're doing here is talking about the idea of a university in Derry. And in response to this, Declan and Peter expressed appreciation of a concept that you introduced, Owen, the pluriversity. Peter asked if you could share a little bit more about how we might invoke the terms pluriverse and pluriversity as ways to open up a critical conversation about the mission of a new embedded institution. And so I'm going to ask Owen, you to respond to that. And then following that, I'm going to ask you, John, to come in, because I see you posted on the Comni University model, which was perhaps catalyzed by Mary's talk. And would you like, I'd like you to talk a little bit about this as a concept of the university and response to Edward's concern, Edward has quite a few, about how would a free Derry university address the role of universities as sites of exploitation themselves? He writes, thinking of precarious work conditions that negatively impact working class and other oppressed groups that are so prevalent in the neoliberal university system. How do we break with this model? Owen, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. Thanks million to all the presentations. And I think in relation to this question, I would firstly consult Irish language to think about how does one to go about describing the universe, or how would you invoke and describe the universe? Or, and I'm attracted to the expression Fuin Spade, which means just under the sky, and Crinne, which would be the translation for universe. But I think that the problematic aspect is that the Western Anglo conception of universe has been used to basically destroy and replace colonized people's understanding of the world. So their concept of the universe is Eurocentric and ethnocentric because it's involved in the denial of other people's worlds. So firstly, I would go to try and get some inspiration from indigenous languages to see if they can offer another understanding of the world and relation to others. But I think that there's definitely a model within La Andina, a university in Ecuador, which Catherine Walsh is involved in, and which is about not having a centralized control, and indigenous people have their own autonomy within the pluriversity to research and set their own research agendas, and they don't have to answer to other people for their needs, so they have that autonomy as well. And I think there's also been the idea of a communiversity, which Fergal McUnrichty has also suggested, and I think Glór Namona, where he's working, is actually probably an example of that in Ireland or in Belfast. I don't know if that's sufficient, if that's enough.
No, that's great. I think John's probably going to add some more. Can you come in, John, and chat about the Comedy University idea?
Communiversity, I mean, essentially is, I mean, there's many ways you can do this, and there are examples around the world, but effectively it means breaking open universities as elitist institutions of knowledge production and engaging with their particularly local communities an awful lot more. So I think I put in the chat new social charters where it's built in to a university's charter, that it's embedded in the community. You know, you could even think about it in terms of governance and curriculum decisions that are not just exclusively being made by academics, but in conversation with their local communities. You know, crowdsourcing the knowledge and the skills and so on that the university should be creating from, again, conversations with students and their local communities. For me, it's drawing upon the tradition of the Irish hedge school, you know, in the sense that these are sites of critical resistance, but they're also practical. And while we should absolutely call out oppressive systems like capitalism and the carbon energy system and divest from fossil fuels and so on, we also have to meet the needs of our local people, you know, jobs, good education, good housing, you know, innovation around food and agroecology. So for me, there's an exciting prospect of these localized experiments in high quality, low carbon ways of life, but they're resolutely locally based, but globally orientated, if you see what I'm trying to get at. But I do think we can look back in history, as certainly Owen has been suggesting we do. And I would say that, you know, let's look back at that tradition of the hedge school and see what inspiration we can find in terms of creating these different types of education provisions, which are much more attuned to the needs of the local community beyond businesses and political elites.
Mary, I am almost sure you're wanting to also bring in some of your discussion here, particularly around the sense of how to address universities as sites of exploitation.
Well, there's in terms of exploitation and precarious work, one thing that the universities here could do at the moment, which they haven't done, is actually become accredited real living wage employers. That's a very simple step that some universities across the water have taken. There's so many financial benefits that could come from the university that just aren't currently, you know, the universities aren't currently seeing themselves in that anchor role where they could be supporting the local economies, you know, and a free Derry university, you know, no local authority in this region has adopted community wealth building as their approach to economic development. And it doesn't have to be, and it has been local authority led in places across the water, but it could actually be led by a university. So I think they have to realize their economic power. We see the Cleveland model, for example, which I referred to a little with the EDS and MEDS, was actually a region within Cleveland known as the Greater University Circle Initiative, where some institutions looked at how the local area weren't benefiting or wasn't benefiting from their huge spend. And so they started up worker cooperatives that could bid for contracts from, in this case, it was actually the hospital. But there's avenues like that universities could go down that are more fair and rather than being about exploitation.
Thank you to the three panelists. What I'm going to do now is read two of the comments that Edward has posted, and almost in a sense leave those as an entrance for Daniel, who's going to be responding to all of the comments. But I have a sense that he will be addressing in his response much of what is bothering you, Edward. Let's see. So I'm sorry, Daniel, if I've set you up. But two comments that Edward makes is it possible to even imagine such a pedagogical institution that is rooted in anti-racism and anti-patriarchy? Would it even be a university at all? And another thought, he says, is there no utopian potential of the university to be recoupled in the service of emancipation? Can the poison contain, or at least some of it, the cure? So thank you to everybody for raising these points. And I'll now bring in Daniel Wall. Daniel's an international consultant, educator, and biologist who specializes in biologically inspired whole systems design and transformative innovation. And he's worked extensively, from working with local groups right through to national governments. Daniel, can you share your thinking with us?
Well, good evening, everybody, and thanks for inviting me to this conversation. I find it particularly important because it is actually something that while we have focused on one specific case in Derry about the potential of building this new university, I actually think that every university around the globe is facing this need for reinvention, for achieving something that you're all familiar with the English nursery rhyme, Humpty Dumpty sat on the wall, Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. And all the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. I believe that to some extent our specialization of knowledge and the fractioning of knowledge into different disciplines through the university process has been a colonialization of the mind that we have to recolonialize or decolonialize. We have to bring the synthesis back together. And as each discipline is generating more and more specialized knowledge, we get a more complex view through more and more specialized lenses, but we're not having the ability to make sense of it. But the minute you take these specialized lenses and make it one requirement for each discipline to take that lens and look at the local region, look at place, look at the history of place, the specificity, cultural, historical, ecological, hydrological, climatological, you name it, and make it an obligation for academics at the local university to actually educate the regional public about the understanding that science and all the different sciences, social sciences and natural sciences, can offer of that place. And through that educational cultural engagement process, you'd position the university as a center of innovation and research in a way that it's meaningful to the local community. And it becomes a driver of local economic diversification, of employment, of relocalizing production and consumption, of regenerating local ecosystems, of building local food sovereignty, local water sovereignty, local energy sovereignty, all of that, basically becoming the learning center for a bioregional regeneration project. And that sits in a much larger context with regard to the extinction crisis that we're in the middle of, which is we have to actually, within the lifetime of the generations alive today, redesign the human impact on Earth completely, from being degenerative, exploitative, and destructive to being healing and regenerative. And the only way to solve this global problematic is actually through local and bioregional action. you can't solve a global problem. It takes you into abstraction and more divorced from the specificity of place solutioneering. But the minute you actually look at the potential of people in place, so you stop solving problems and you start manifesting potential through the lens of place and the lens of region, then the university has a real meaning again, because all the disciplines can offer wealth of insight on how people in place can start to learn, be regenerative in that place. And in doing so, create a regenerative economic system that is supportive of their well-being. And this is not in any way competitive or alternative to what anybody has presented so far. Everybody's presentation are completely aligned with this approach. That kind of university as a bioregional learning center would drive community wealth and would behave in the way that these institutions are beginning to behave. But I think it's a huge opportunity, and I'm excited to have been able to comment on this. I've shared a few, like in the links of I've shared a longer presentation I gave about this concept of universities as bioregional learning centers, and some reflection about regenerative cultures and educational institutions in general. The name of my book is Designing Regenerative Cultures, not Designing Regenerative Futures. That was a slip earlier. Yeah, so I'm looking forward to the conversation rather than spending a long time monologuing. But this notion, just to bring it together, this notion that a university could actually do what all the universities I've been engaged with have been talking about for decades: interdisciplinarity, knowledge transfer, getting out of the ivory tower. All of this is achievable the minute a university becomes a bioregional learning center and actually engages with local people and local place in a way that helps local government and local business to generate local employment in the process of creating an economy that has regeneration, increasing local soil fertility, increasing forest cover, cleaning rivers at the heart of its economic activity. And the time for that is ripe. There's European support for that and so on. And also what's interesting, just very briefly, because what John Barry said with people, planet, and place, at the end reminded me of Patrick Geddes. And I think in this context, it's good to remember that in Scotland, there's a lot of similarities of having suffered similar traumas, and people have actually responded to it also over the last century in interesting ways. And I would look at Geddes's bioregional city and region connection, because it's culturally resonant. And I'll leave it at that for now, but there's lots of other things. Oh, one more thing. There's a wonderful place in the south of England run by a woman called Isabel Carlyle. And I would, in this context, maybe say, don't get put off by the name of it, because it's called the Bioregional Learning Center UK. But look at it, look at the website, look at what they're actually doing. They're a wonderful South Devon-based bioregional learning center that is using a lot of what we've explored this evening within, for example, the context of building a local donut for South Devon, but also engaging local fishermen and local storytelling to basically just engage and make people fall in love and create or reconnect to their own agency in their region. And she's doing it independently, but universities could play that role. And so it's also a wonderful model, Bioregional Learning Center UK. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daniel. I can really sense your energy and enthusiasm behind the idea. There have been some comments in the chat. Ryan Keys has written a comment, very interesting, about being from Derry and their experience as a student at Cambridge University, asking if the students have any thoughts on whether or not pre-existing institutions can contribute to the project of decolonizing higher education in a way that is truly meaningful and not just performative. And then Jan Caspers, I think Jan or Jan, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce that. My South Africanism is coming out. Shared about hedge schools as schools of shelter, shouting out and summoning, which sounds incredible. Jan, I wonder, would you like to come in and share a little bit more? That's okay. What I'd like to do now is open up for anyone who is here as who would like to speak. If you can raise the hand button, then I'll ask you to speak.
Jan would like to speak.
Ah, thank you. I can't actually see, after having said that, I can't see the hand.
I don't know how to raise the hand button. So I had to raise
then
my,
please do.
I had to raise my actual hand. I just wrote a wee thing because it struck me. The hedge school. Because the hedge school is very closely linked, not just to education. Like historically, when Irish institutions of education weren't able to function anymore, and then went almost literally underground, or went kind of onto the ground, out of the building anyway, where they would certainly have been in buildings before, and went. That's why it's called the hedge school. But it's just nice because in the Irish, there's a couple of different words, but Scoil Scarcha is the one that I would have learned, and which means the school of the hedge school. But it also means Scoil Scarcha. It means the school that you can, what way you want to translate it, the school that shouts out, or the school that calls out or calls people in, like that. So it just struck me. It's a nice thing, because we're talking about it in English, but it's probably useful to mention that as one of the necessities, but also opportunities that the language history and situation brings about. You mentioned the field day was mentioned, and there's of course the play translations by Brian Field. So you've got that situation in Ireland and in the northwest of Ireland, of the two languages, or one language that has been almost pushed over the brink, not quite, and the valiant struggle has been put up over many years by many people in many different ways to keep it alive and make it blossom again. But it'll be useful, I think, to keep in mind also, because part of the whole problem with academe and with the academic institution, as we know now, is within language as well, not between kind of different languages like as Irish and English, but between language, because the academic world kind of affects its own kind of sociolect, or whatever you want to call it, and uses that with quite brutal force to exclude people and to disenfranchise popular knowledge and ways of understanding. So it's probably the fact that there is kind of a strong input of Irish, of the idea of Irish language and the inputs of Irish language that has been mentioned here and will be in another talk tomorrow. It's an opportunity to also look at language in general and how it impacts and how it can open up spaces by looking at it.
There's quite a lot of work done in South African universities around language reclamation, but also the intellectualization of languages and the difficulty of, I guess, what you're trying to point to here about how it can discipline language too, and shape it in ways that the university does damage to it.
Could I also just make a point, Dana, before it goes out of my head on language, but as well as the more traditional, subaltern and excluded languages, there's also, certainly from my own experience within the university, the language of economization, the language of efficiency, the language of the market that's increasingly coming in to determine what is taught, how it's taught, who decides. So that's another very, very powerful language we need to be aware of.
Absolutely. Edward, would you like to come in?
Yes. Are you able to hear me? Yeah.
Yep.
And so thank you very much. I mean, I think it's been a really amazing and really interesting discussion. And I think that I suppose there's been some really wonderful imaginings of how a university might function in the spirit of a Free Derry University. And I suppose the question, I think there's there appears to be anyway some sort of a fair bit of consensus using different types of models, from economics right through to humanities, right through to environmentalism. But I suppose the question, the urgent question, is in some ways, how does this university come into being? What is the processes, or what are the mechanisms by which we can actually create this space and create this form of enterprise? I mean, obviously, the demand for university in Derry is a long-standing one that sort of reaches into the civil rights movement and even beyond that. And I think the point has been made repeatedly and well that the time is now more than any other. But the question still sort of remains, maybe perhaps one of strategy, and maybe it's not the appropriate forum, as to how do we produce this university? How do we create it? What alliances are necessary? What engagement with politics? Do we start outside the university system entirely? Do we start within communities and build up to some sort of pluriversity, or do we sort of go for the macro level of sort of institutional funding through the state, through the Northern Irish state, through the Southern Irish state? And I'd just be interested to hear what people's thoughts are on how do we sort of enact some of these or release rather the utopian potential of a free Derry University.
Thank you, Edward. Thanks to the organizers, is a high-level debate already happening within governments in both London and Derry about the future of higher education or a university provision in the Derry-Donegal region. I'm sure you've seen that discussion paper by the Royal Irish Academy, and I'm sure it'll be referenced in relation to this talk as a resource as well. But there's also been another document titled A Vision for the Northwest, which was prepared by the Derry University Group, which I'm hoping will also be posted today. But it was asking us really, in a sense, how we'd like to see this shaped. So before I move on to Declan, I'm wondering if anybody would like to come in on that and respond to Edward's point. There's Marianne there. So she's saying that she'd like to have follow-up events and for us to come together and have more plans. Jim will be discussing future events, particularly that follow on from the series, to do that very much. I don't know if you want to mention anything here, Jim, before I move on to Declan. Are you all right? Okay. So Declan, can you introduce your point for us?
Yes, I would like to develop Owen's concept of the pluriversity, and I think he would allude to it in his thinking in relation to what I would like to see as feminization of society and in the way in which that would manifest. So one of the initiatives that has got me really excited about returning to Ireland recently is the development in the northwest of the rights of nature. And indeed, the head school analogy is perfect for that in the way in which things can grow through learning, and the rights of nature are taking hold of the imagination within the northwest, and people are imagining a different world. And I think that sort of pluriversal approach in terms of the traits associated with a feminist approach to decolonization and to the way in which we can imagine a world of worlds is crucial. And yeah, I'd just like to hear what Owen thinks on that.
Owen, if you would like to come in, you're very welcome.
Thanks very much, Declan, for that observation. And well, I think of it when you talk about feminization, that kind of speaks to, I guess, the relationship with the land as well, which is within Irish epistemologies, or Gaelic epistemology is usually referred to as a woman, Éire, Fóla, Banva. So I think that that's very important for also, but the idea of the pluriversity, as I understand it, is that there's also various exteriorized and discriminated groups that are discriminated on the basis of race, because I think that race and gender, race and gender are co-constructing each other in colonial contexts, and I think that that really needs to be centered as well. And in terms of a pluriverse in Ireland, I would imagine that there would have to be like a serious movement against direct provision as well, and the war against black life, and with also the acknowledgement that whiteness itself, the construction of whiteness and white privilege, has benefited a lot of people in Ireland because of our participation in the EU, and the fact that we have signed up to an imperial union where the likes of France, Britain, and Germany have decided to not turn their weapons against each other, but continually turn them against people in what is referred to as the global south, in the Middle East, and continually letting people drown in the Mediterranean. That there is a system of racial violence, and there is a privilege in being white, designated as white, and being able to navigate through as an individual without reference to your ancestors' experience of violence and discrimination. So I think that a holistic approach, which looks at the coloniality of nature as also concomitant and organized by racism and sexism as well, and that's going on today, needs to be very seriously reflected on as well. I think yeah, that's the point. And maybe if I could just say about Edward Malloy's point, which speaks to this. I mean, capitalism in Ireland and anywhere is racial capitalism, and according to Cedric Robinson and his book Black Marxism, the only reason why capitalism was and European gained so-called competitive advantages through enslavement of millions of people, and by using race as a justification, and the idea of white supremacy. So they need to be taken seriously into account. And the racialization of Irish workers in Britain, the racialization of Irish Catholics living in the north of Ireland as well. These are all oppression is interlinked into each other, because capitalism is a civilizatory process, as Ramon Gros Fogel would argue. And I think that they needs to be considered the racial matrix of power, along with questions of repatriating nature as well.
We have a little bit of time, and so I'd like to just read out Sarah Plummer's question, which takes us in a different direction. She asks, what do panelists think of Stormon's failure to deliver on NDNA, which included a commitment to 10,000 students in Magee? The Irish government also made significant commitments, yet we do not seem to make any progress on with expanding Magee or with developing a new university in Derry. I speak as a Derry woman who is a lecturer in Scotland, but was unable to study my subject in Derry. So this is to the panelists. I wonder if I can have John and then Mary come in on this.
I really feel that this is for the folk in Derry involved in this particular struggle. I mean, are we surprised that so many of commitments by politicians haven't been made? And, you know, I'm not telling people here anything they don't know already. This is a political struggle. You know, I don't know whether the opportunity of the upcoming assembly election is a leverage point for prospective MLAs. But, you know, once again, we have to call out politicians for their hypocrisy of saying one thing and then not delivering. I mean, it ends up that, you know, promises to, you know, develop a university in Derry, a bit like having climate change legislation, ends up like the Irish football team, you know, great on paper, crap on grass. Other teams are available.
I can see one hand up. I'm sorry, you're under Bloody Sunday March. Would you like to speak? I'm
recording this, but I also wanted to give a wee bit of input because, again, I am from Derry and I've been through I've been through McGee for my bachelor's and then I went through Queen's for my master's. So and I come from, I would say, a very impoverished area. Within a 5-mile radius, there's only a chapel and a spar. So there's 3 things I kind of want to just chime in about. It's people, place, and poverty. So Derry especially is most of its inhabitants is the center of the world, but it's also hanging off the edge of the earth. Like in terms of like geographically, we are beside like this big body of water and we do nothing with it. And we're just pushed off to the side. So it's more about encouraging people to get involved with like concepts such as this, because I know most people in my area, they don't have time to be interested in activism. They don't engage with education unless they really fight for it. And especially there's very little access courses here. And even the courses that are in McGee are being duplicated into the Belfast campus, which they shouldn't be. So especially with the Belfast campus opening up, when a lot of that money was supposed to be contributed to McGee's funding for expansion. But what I wanted to say is just the fact that engagement really needs to happen with people in trade, people that really wouldn't be the typical academics, because those are the ones that make up the populace of Derry. They're the ones that have activist hearts, but not the time to be active. That's what I mean. See, the area I'm from, there's a lot of frustrations, and there's always like bonfires or illegal happenings because they feel they don't have the time to think about the effects of capitalism when they're already burnt by it. So stuff like this here is great for like long term, but structurally things need to change at the base. So people in like impoverished communities and like highly Republican or loyalist areas, that engagement needs to happen. And I think like even we like think tank groups, we book groups, and then expand from there. And then that's how you can get like a pluralist university, or you can implement some sort of socio-anachronistic thinking in these wee bubbles. They make it a larger thing, make them a collective, make everybody engaged in education and want to move on from there. Cheers.
Thank you so much. I think I'm going to stop with your comments because you've given a real sense of being a person in this time, a younger person in this time. Expectations in the place that you're in. So I'd like to say that while there is no one university, because there are indeed many, and thankfully, they're different in form and content and intent across the world and across time and histories. There are dominant models that become so powerful and oppressive, they can crowd out our field of vision and threaten to obliterate the imaginations, the ways of being and doing of those whose interests they don't serve. So our speakers today have given us a range of counter stories, such as Mary's centering of communal principles within anchor universities, Barry's seeds, as he described them, that he shared about strategic partnerships, strong referential frames, including sustainability, and a sense of the urgency of the impending crisis, which Daniel then picked up on and asserted about this being an opportunity for infusing regenerative cultures across the curriculum, for transdisciplinarity, and also co-curation to drive community prosperity. There is a suggestion that counter stories may be generative for you as you inform the deliberations to come about the idea of a Derry University, also about its commitments, its politics, its pragmatics. While many aspects of the talks did this, Owen in particular reminded us of how this discussion is part of a much longer counter-narrative of this place now, yes, of civil rights and Bloody Sunday half a century ago. 700s, a strong counter-narrative that, if engaged with critically, can continue to be transformative as we move towards the future. So how do we move beyond this? How do we follow up on this talk? What is going to happen now? How can this be pushed through after this long, long call for a university? And how long will you wait? In their comments, Marion, Ryan, Sandra are noting their impatience, but also their energy. The question is, how many generations will pass? So I'd like to thank the speakers and the audience tonight for your attentiveness and engagement tonight, and the organizers, Peter Doran and Jim Keys, for ensuring that the framing of this event enabled rigorous and meaningful discussion. I'll now hand over to Jim to tell us more about related events that hopefully, in a sense, answer some of the questions that I've ended with.
Thank you, Dina, for beautifully and masterfully chairing this event. It's fulfilled and exceeded my expectations. Thank you to the speakers and the contributors, and to the people that I know that are in the call too. So beautiful to see you there, my friends. The killings on Bloody Sunday took out 14 possibilities, not to mention the possibilities taken out by the community license to kill. It opened up for non-state actors. This is Foyle Ethical Investment Campaign's first relaunch since Raytheon left the city. And it's the first of a series of events we launch on the 50th anniversary deliberately as a way of both living into the inscription on the monument in Roswell Street to those killed that day, that their epitaph is in the ongoing struggle for democracy. And also as a way of giving back agency and opening up possibilities. So this is the first possibility we're opening up, a free university, a University of Free Derry. And we hope in a series of other meetings and podcasts and Zooms, depending on where we're at with nature, with the COVID, that we're hoping that our next event will be an In Conversation event podcast with Joanna Macy, who has done beautiful work on the 3 meta stories we live in, which are business as usual, which is the dominant one that catches most of us and colonizes our imagination. Then the great unraveling, which can run us around frantically trying to sellotape it all together. But the great turning is the story we live in when we refuse to let the first 2 stories hold us, and we co-create a new story, and that is where we're going next, and other events will follow. So thank you very much, one and all, for the contributions tonight and for being part of it, for just listening and taking it forward. And I really love the fact that it was so compelling that the person who was tasked with just listening to the events had to speak himself. So, and recording them. So thank you, David, for speaking. So thank you, everyone. Yeah, maybe we can unmute as we just before we get shut out, and just anybody can say. So thank you, everyone. I like it when voices come in, if people want to say hello and thank you. Hello, Peter.
Thanks,
John.
Jim.
Thanks.
Yeah,
That's
thank
a
you.
special thank you
Thank
to
you,
Dina.
Dan from Brazil. It's Peter in Belfast, Mary.
Thanks, Jim.
Everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Ryan Keys, my nephew. Jan in Germany. Beautiful to see people. Mary McGuigan there somewhere from Zero Waste. Yeah, Liam and Dora Ray. Thank you, Liam, for being here. It's so nice that you're here.
There's Desmond Wilson from Toronto as well.
Desmond Wilson from Toronto. Thank you, Dina. People call out people, shout people out. Just this is building community. We have to build community, break down the isolation. So, yeah. Is that hello, Megan McDermott? I don't know you, but nice to see you. Yeah. So yeah, lovely event. Thank you very much. I'm inspired, and it was yeah. So thank you. So maybe we'll close now. Okay, I'm going to sign off, and yeah, this was great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Good
you,
night, everyone.
Bye,
everyone.
Jim.
Very
Thanks.
well.